good evening, and welcome to Talk Gnosis. I'm Bishop Lainey Peterson, and unfortunately my co-host, Bishop Canterbury, can't be with us tonight. Tonight our topic is the Independent Sacramental Movement, also known as the ISM or the Independent Movement. And our guest tonight is a very old and dear friend of mine, John Plummer. Dr. Plummer is an independent bishop and holds a PhD from the Graduate Theological Foundation. He has written some books on the ISM and is a frequent speaker at churches and events. John, welcome. So good to see you.
Thanks, Lainey. It's really nice to be with you tonight.
We were reminiscing before the program started. John had actually been made a bishop the day before I received my deacon and priesthood ordination, and he was kind enough to remind me that I wore at least some of his vestments at my ordination. So it's wonderful to have these memories coming back. We're going to dive right in here, John. Can you tell us about the ISM? What is the Independent Sacramental Movement in a nutshell?
Well, it's rather hard to define, as you well know, and it goes by many different names. The ISM is just a term that I chose to use when I was working on my doctoral dissertation, and it's kind of stuck in certain circles. I actually stole it in some ways from Richard Smoley, who used it in a prior book, and in the 1970s, there was a group that used the name, but it's what people refer to as independent Catholicism, non-canonical orthodoxy, free priesthood. There's just lots of different ways of describing it. It tends to be splinter groups from larger sacramentally oriented denominations like the Roman Catholicism, the Anglican Communion, Orthodoxy, where people have spun off from those structures and either in freelance ways or in little groupings of their own have found ways of going forward, maintaining a sacramentally oriented ecclesial practice and spirituality, even if they're tinkering a little bit around the edges with this and that. So, and some, of those groups would be identified with contemporary Gnostic movements, and some would most definitely not. So.
Most definitely not. Yeah. And I think sometimes I've encountered people who hear about the ISM or they know that, excuse me, I've been ordained in an independent Sacramental Movement church, and they'll say, well, how are things going in the ISM? Or they seem to think that it's a group or a denomination in its own right. And of course, as we both know, there are many ISM churches that may be part of the movement that will have nothing to do with each other. And this may include some extremely ultra conservative, more Catholic than the Pope churches that don't like the current papacy, all the way to definitely Christo-pagan groups as well.
Or beyond.
What you tend to see, and maybe you can correct me, but what I usually see is there usually is some kind of hierarchical structure with bishops and priests and deacons, and a notion of apostolic succession to some degree.
To some degree, yeah, a mediatory priesthood, definitely. Yeah. Like even if they've tried to squash the hierarchy to some sense, the notion that there is a mediatory priesthood that is administering sacraments seems to be the common thread. And even when you get outside of people who want to talk about traditional succession, you still get them perpetuating the same pattern.
Yeah. And for example, they tend to be sacramental churches in that they will have liturgy and certain sacraments, but even the number of sacraments can vary depending on the body. So when we say movement, we really mean that it's a very large grouping that kind of. Yeah.
It's herding cats, and yet there is this sort of family resemblance in a Wittgensteinian sense among these things. Like it when you see it, you can smell it from a distance, and you're like, oh yeah, you're one of us. And but it's very hard to come up with any one set of characteristics that washes across everything. And yet, to me, one of the most curious things is that people are incredibly mobile within it. And you can meet someone who's like over here on the right wing in some sort of like quite conservative, quite, Orthodox Byzantine type group. And then the next thing you know, they're over here and in some kind of Grail oriented Christo-pagan, and And I think that comes out of authentic searching in most cases, perhaps a little craziness in some others, but you know, it's just a little, you know.
A little bit.
I always say, at least in our world, we have so little power we can't really harm others with our nuttiness. And but the and there again, you know, it's the, I think, somewhat the movement of individuals among the different groups and the different sort of identities within the movement that also helps to weld things together, because it is connections of friendship and knowing one another that it's one big messy family.
And it's not a connection of funds or money. I mean, we've seen, for example, a number of Protestant denominations, including the United Methodist Church, that have been beating the heck out of each other for a long time over certain issues, and they don't break up because of pension funds and
No.
property and real estate. And the ISM movement churches in general have very little money or property, if any at all.
Yeah.
And so it's really quite easy to break up when you have all these schisms going.
It is, and you know, before we started, we were talking about our Colston Brown, who also has some connections to this world, and he used to say that these things are, you know, they're like thinking of them as permanent structures may not be so wise. I mean, they're a vocation to have a permanent structure, but for many, it's sort of a formation in order to do something together, and then, like the dandelion, it breaks up, and then things regrow and move, and that's okay. And I think that, like the anarchist theorist Peter Lamborn Wilson talks about temporary autonomous zones, and I often think that's a useful image of what ISM communities are like. They're temporary autonomous zones. They don't exist forever. They're little spaces of freedom in which people come together to do something, and then when that time ends, they move along. And we don't have to see that as disaster. We just see that as organic movement and growth.
Absolutely, and I think you're right. There is that freedom, and the interesting thing is we've seen a little bit of this in the emerging church missional movement, where people are meeting for in third places, and we've seen that even though that's more of a Protestant movement without some of the this is actually becoming our way of operating is actually becoming a little more mainstream.
That's right. A friend of mine who's actually quite involved in the emergent movement just showed me a book yesterday or the day before about some new book that's out about how to be a Christian without you know, being involved in like a Sunday morning church. And I'm like, yeah, we know what to do, and
We've been doing that for a long time.
We've been doing that for a long time, and I do think in some ways it's people kind of reclaiming a certain level of control over their spiritual lives, or that they can feed themselves, that they can take care of their sacramental life and their family's sacramental life. You know, you don't always have to go out to eat. You can eat at home.
Yeah.
And that it just takes different forms. I mean, I'm very lucky that I do have a chance to regularly participate in a number of larger communities, but there have also been periods in my life when I've been a very isolated person. But you know, the movement actually flexes and moves in both ways. And our Catherine Adams, who ordained you to the priesthood, she used to say that she felt that part of what the independent movement was about was the development of a flexible, portable version of Christianity that worked in the 21st century. And I think,
yeah, I think so. I mean, it's interesting. You and I both met. You were at Vanderbilt Divinity School. I was at Garrett Evangelical Seminary. In many ways, we had traditional preparation, but we ended up joining this wackadoodle movement, which actually kind of foreshadowed what's been going of mainstream churches now. So it's kind of been interesting. Kind of a little bit to Gnosticism. Now, some people who are watching this who are interested in Gnosticism may be confused. What does the ISM have to do with Gnosticism? And I do want to point out that there are many, many practicing Gnostics who have nothing to do with the ISM. They have no interest in sacrament or liturgy or priesthood or anything like that, and they're very outspoken, and many of them are very, very bright people, so I don't want to diss them for that. But there are a number of Gnostic churches that follow this, that are part of the ISM and who have bishops and councils, and we have rings and crosses and miters and funny hats and all that glorious stuff. So what's the connection there? Can you talk a little bit about how that happened?
Well, it's somewhat messy. I think there are two large pieces where sort of contemporary Gnosticism and independent sacramental churches begin to collide with one another. And one would be 19th century France, where there were a variety of different movements, most significantly the L'Église Gnostique of Jules Douanel, which was not originally embroiled with apostolic succession, but came up with its own sui generis lineage and then got sort of melded at one point. But, they made an attempt through sort of visionary experience and a revival of certain liturgical forms to kind of reach backwards into Catharism, into earlier forms of Christian Gnosticism. And, one can say what one wants about the historical basis of all of that. But that was a stream of people very interested in things like Martinism, Freemasonry, different forms of esotericism that were forming a kind of ecclesial community that allowed or encouraged or gave shape to some of those aspirations in a church setting. So you've got that, and then in England and Australia, you've got the formation of the Liberal Catholic Church, which was spun out of sort of old Catholicism and around the figure of Arnold Harris Matthew, which wasn't his real name, but that's a whole other story. But a certain number of Theosophists, followers of Madame Blavatsky, became involved in that church, eventually got on the wrong side of its leadership, largely over dispute over, can you believe in these things and reincarnation and spiritual masters and whatever, and still be part of this, and created a church that very intentionally did not mandate those things, but provided an embrace for them. And so then you've got, it sort of spins from there. But with those two kind of impulses coming from the French world and from the English-speaking world, you begin to see an emergence of an explicit esoteric approach within a segment of the independent movement. And then other people come along, the, Duc de Palatine and Stefan Heller and Rosamund Miller and Rudolf Steiner's Christian Gemeinschafts and all of these things that sort of take different directions. But how did this crazy family begin to make room for this type of expression? I think you can look back to L'Église Gnostique and the LCC. It seems to me.
Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to point out, I know that we did a show on books earlier, and I did recommend this book, Priests, Gnostics, and Magicians by Siobhan Houston. I believe you have a blurb on the back of here.
I was actually her dissertation supervisor.
Oh, excellent, excellent. But for those who are interested in this connection, this is actually a great book. And you've had a couple of books out about the independent movement yourself. Can you give those titles?
Yeah, my dissertation, which is the best known one, is The Many Paths of the Independent Sacramental Movement. There's a little one called Living Mysteries that's more of a how-to manual. Very, very recently, just a couple of months ago, a new book came out on a figure called Mikhail Itkin, who certainly had crossover into the Gnostic world, and there is a chapter by me in that. It's called The Radical Bishop and the Gay Consciousness. And he, at different times, he was an independent Catholic, a Mennonite, an anarchist, a gay activist, an Orthodox-style bishop, and several other things besides. And kind of a wild man, but an interesting figure. So those are some.
That's great. Well, thank you very much for sharing, and we'll actually probably include those links, hopefully either on the YouTube video or on our own website. I do want to say that I want to ask the audience a question to facilitate some discussion about this. How do you feel about the sacramental and restructure of many Gnostic churches, or the apostolic hierarchy that you see in a lot of Gnostic churches? Does this appeal to you, or do you prefer that Gnostic communities operate and practice differently? Please include your comments on our YouTube channel. We'd love to have some discussion with you about that. I do want to remind everybody that we do not have any advertising on this show, and we depend on the support of our patrons and friends. If you have enjoyed this show and found it helpful, you can support us at Patreon, reon.com/Gnostic. You can pledge a small amount of money per video or podcast, and you can cap that off. If you can only donate $5 a month, you can actually set a cap on the amount that you want to spend, and everything that you pledge directly supports the development of this and other programs with Gnostic NYC. We really appreciate your support. Also want to remind folks that after this, we'll be recording the After Dark podcast. Now, if you are a Patreon supporter, you can actually sit in on that recording. Otherwise, the After Dark podcast with Bishop Plummer will be broadcast within a few days, and you can follow that on our Talk Gnosis Facebook page. And we'd love to, you can also sign up on iTunes or Stitcher. Or you can find an RSS feed on our website at talkgnosis.gnosticnyc.com. And as always, we appreciate your feedback and your ideas and hearing from you. So please do follow us on Facebook, and join us next week for another episode of Talk Gnosis. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.